Hello, my name is Betsy Cunningham, and I'm with uh, Douglas County Citizen News, Views, and Reviews, which is a new citizen journalism effort that's part of a collective effort that just started here in Douglas County. And so, one of the things that we want to profile is the history of Douglas County, um, and so our co-host is with Community Rights Douglas County, John
Yeah,
Hunter.
yeah, you want me to go now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm John Hunter with Community Rights Douglas County, and empowering our local communities in order to create a more democratic society is one of the basic principles of community rights. Uh, Today, as we know, this process is even more challenging than ever, but it has also been a part of Douglas County's history for quite a while. And so tonight we will be learning uh, about the new Odessa community, which was an immigrant community that settled in southern Douglas County in the 1880s, and we'll be learning about their attempts to establish a more just and democratic community. So we are pleased to be working with the Douglas County Citizen Education and Advocacy and the Civics uh, Project, which are two other groups that advocate for democracy, to be hosting this presentation, and it'll be hosted by Zach Whitworth, uh, a local historian, and we go into graduate school at U of O next fall, and so I will turn over to you, Zach.
All right. Thanks, John and Betsy. Let me get my slides up. All right. How are we looking?
Okay.
Very good. All right. Let's see. Oh, get my cursor right on here. Screen sharing. I don't give too many presentations on Zoom, so this is also kind of new to me. There we go. That'll do. All right. So I'll start out with a bit of an introduction about myself, and then I'll talk about how the presentation is going to go. So I'm Zach. I was born and raised here in good old Douglas County. Mostly grew up between Roseburg and Glide. I went to college later in Ashland and Portland, so I'm Oregonian through and through. And for most of my life, I've lived in Southern Oregon, but it is very easy, I found, to live in a place, even for one's whole life, yet to know very little about it, about its history, about how the community came to be, and what existed here before us. And when I first stumbled upon an article about New Odessa several years ago, I didn't really think that much about it. It seemed little more than a curiosity, just a footnote in the history of the county. But I think around late 2021, I came across another piece about New Odessa. This was Helen Blumenthal's master's thesis from 1975. She was a history student at Portland State University, which is where I actually graduated from. Um, and she had done original research, and wrote an entire 100+ page paper on this community, New Odessa. It's titled United We Stand, Divided We Fall. It's available online if you want to look it up. happy to share it through our channels. So I knew there was really something there, that New Odessa was not some little blip in the history of this region, but was itself highly complex and connected to a much broader global history. And the fact that this community consisted of a core membership of Russian Jews, it was almost personal for me. My own relatives were Russian Jews who came to the United States a little later in the early 20th century, but some of whom were also involved in the revolutionary movement that sought to overthrow the regime of the Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, and bring about a democratic society. My great uncle Alexander was thrown in prison for his activities during the failed 1905 revolution in Russia. And this was about a decade before the revolution that saw the Bolsheviks take power and establish the Soviet Union. And Alex managed to escape to the United States, like many revolutionaries did, like some people will talk about. And he helped to bring his family members here, including my great grandparents. So, learning of New Odessa and its interesting intersections with the struggles my own relatives lived through, and my life as a lifelong local in Douglas County has led me to try to take responsibility for this history and to try to do it justice. And we can discuss why it's in need of that a bit later on. So how this presentation is going to go, I don't give a lot of presentations. I have not gone to graduate school yet, as John said. I'm still learning. So we're going to have a couple points for questions I'll open up for just to get some clarifications at a couple points. We're going to talk a lot about the prehistory of New Odessa. Much of the lack in the historical scholarship is in what happens before New Odessa. What are the ideas that are floating around in Russia, among Jews in Russia, and in the United States in this period in the late 19th century? So we'll talk about that. And the second portion of this presentation is going to be a little more flexible. I've got looser notes on the community of New Odessa itself. And in that point, we can talk about maybe some more things that people in the audience are specifically interested in hearing about. And we'll be a bit more minimal on the slides just due to lack of a lot of historical imagery from this subject. All right. So I want to start us with a scene in the year 1888. This is 137 years ago in a shabby little household somewhere in London, England. Sometime in late October or early November, we find a man by the name of William Frey on his deathbed. He has been in great pain, reportedly due to a failing heart. He has been coughing up blood increasingly over the last few years, and he has been furiously writing down as much as he can of his ideas. And eventually, when he's no longer able to write himself, he dictates to his companions, who write his last testament and determine to publish his words however they can. Frey, whose birth name was Vladimir Konstantinovich Gaines, was a Russian living in exile. He had been a friend of the great Russian author Leo Tolstoy, and born into the Russian nobility, he had come to give up his privileged life entirely, turning to a life of strict moral discipline, which also meant poverty. He was a vegetarian in his own terms, although today we would say he was more of an extreme raw vegan. He wouldn't even eat most bread or anything baked. And he was credited with convincing Tolstoy to himself live as a vegetarian. Uh, Frey was a very dogmatic man, um, as well as a professed man of science, and he was a pious preacher of what was called the religion of humanity. And the religion of humanity was a fairly niche religious movement developed by the French philosopher of science, Auguste Comte, in the 1850s before he died. And it was modeled after Catholicism, from the liturgy to a clerical hierarchy headed by a high priest, but the concept of God was substituted with the concept of humanity. Humanity itself, in the abstract, was the object of worship and reverence. And it was premised on living in accordance with scientifically deduced natural laws. Uh, History and social progress were not things that could be shaped by human agency, by human activity, but were inevitable and unchangeable. Thus, the task of every individual was to learn to live in conformity and harmony with the cosmic order. Uh, it's really a child of radical conservative thought in Europe after the French Revolution. And indeed, it was pretty explicitly anti-revolutionary. So it might at first seem strange that on his deathbed, Frey was paid a visit by one of the most famous promoters of social revolution in modern history, a fellow Russian and political exile named Pyotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin. Kropotkin and Frey were both friends of the Russian radical Nikolai Vasilyevich Tchaikovsky. He was a major figure in the Narodnik movement, or the Russian Popular Socialist movement. It literally means like of the people. This was in the 1860s and 1870s. Kropotkin had been thrown in prison in Russia for his participation in Tchaikovsky's educational circle, which produced anti-czarist propaganda. And after Tchaikovsky's disillusionment with the prospects of revolution in Russia, he had attempted to establish a godly agricultural community in the United States, in Kansas, actually, called Cedarvale. And Frey had lived at Cedarvale, also trying to establish a harmonious, religiously bound community until 1879, after Tchaikovsky had given up and moved to settle in England. And Frey, too, had come to believe people were not ready to live a serious life of moral conviction and purpose. So one imagines Kropotkin, despite their serious differences, had this great respect for Frey. Frey was clearly a man of his word. He seriously tried to live in accordance with his beliefs. Kropotkin, like Frey, was of the high Russian nobility, of one of the oldest aristocratic families in Russia. He was by profession a geographer, and he had conducted key early research on glaciation and the last ice age. His best known work today, considered a key text in natural science and the study of evolution, is called Mutual Aid, which develops an alternative theory from mainstream Darwinism. It argues that the struggle for existence in the theory of natural selection, as it was put forward by Darwin, is not solely defined by physical strength and capacity for violence, not domination, competition, or conflict among members of a species, but just as much and potentially more so, it is advanced through cooperation, self-sacrifice, sharing, and attending to the needs of fellow members of the group. So to be fit in the survival of the fittest would be to have greater social characteristics. A species is better adapted to survive and thrive by way of its ability to work together, to support all members of the group, and to provide assistance or resources to those who need it. Where Kropotkin and Frey converged in their thinking was their shared hope of realizing a communistic society. Now, it's important for us to have a clear understanding of what communism means here. We're not talking about the Soviet Union. That's still about 40 years down the road. And it's not the same as what gets called Marxism. Karl Marx was increasingly read in this period, and Kropotkin had read some of his writings in the Tchaikovsky circle, but for the most part, the revolutionary thought of the day among Russians was largely informed by more popular authors. These included Nikolai Chernyshevsky, Alexander Herzen, Pyotr Lavrov, Mikhail Bakunin, among many others who comprised the popular socialist movement. And socialism, I should note, could be defined as a tendency or inclination favoring ownership of land and production by a society rather than by individuals, typically through the society's institutions. And although there have been many varieties of approaches to socialism, how it should be arranged, who manages what, etc., it has most generally been advocated in democratic terms. So social ownership doesn't just mean government ownership, which tends to be controlled by a relatively small group of people, but ownership and control by all members of the society who can come together in political bodies to manage the common stock of the community through discussion and deliberation and voting and so on. So communism falls within that tendency. It is better defined as a clear set of conditions and principles by which a community lives. These would include the effective absence of private property. Now, not necessarily personal property in all cases, but most especially privately held land. This would be based on an understanding that the earth itself and the natural resources of the world are the common inheritance of all life, including humankind. And for any one person to be excluded from this inheritance by sectioning off territory and resources for private use, and especially private profiteering, would be to rob humankind of what is naturally owed to them. Communism also features the absence of wage labor, of hiring workers for one job or another in a hierarchical employer-employee relationship, which generally privileges the employer. And with that, communism also maintains a lack of economic classes. There are no rich people sharing a society with poor people in depraved conditions, in starvation. In anthropological terms, this would entail the upholding of what gets called an irreducible minimum, which is to say there is a basic standard of living, of decent life that all in a society are afforded. And in many cases, this might involve individuals deliberately redistributing any excessive private gains. And this is all typically summarized in the communistic principle of organizing an economy around a common stock from which resources are distributed from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs. Okay, so perhaps this is a discussion between Kropotkin and the dying Frey. Kropotkin is very much an atheist and reviles the domination he sees inherent in organizing a society around a religion, whereas Frey insists communism could only be possible if the community were indoctrinated with a religious discipline that demanded altruistic behavior, including through his strict diet. And Frey claims to have a successful example of the religion of humanity being taken up by a community that did come to live this way. And what he writes in one of his last pamphlets is what I imagine he also says to Kropotkin during this visit. So I'll read a quote from Frey. He says, "It was 3 years ago when I lived in a Russian community in Oregon that I witnessed a curious moment in the life of Russian nihilists whose fierce opposition to any restraint whatever was gradually calmed down and substituted by the interest and sympathy toward the religion of humanity. Before even they were able to account for the change that was going on in them, they had turned all their energy into self-improvement. And although I always kept my diet notions in the background and never represented them as an indisputable or binding deduction of our religion, all of the members of the community abandoned the use of tobacco, intoxicating drinks, tea, and coffee, and some of them totally and forever abstained from meat. All this was accomplished without any compulsion or vote by a majority, but with the spontaneity and resolution so characteristic among the religious converts. And it is one of the most gratifying pleasures of my life to see and to watch the development of these young men who, in spite of hard labor and poverty, are constantly improving their health, whose hygienic notions only increase their devotion to our religion, and who are full of thanks to humanity for the enjoyment which they find in life, since they abandon the sensual and engrossing habits." So Kropotkin, I expect, takes great interest in this. Frey's religion of humanity aside, here was a group of young Russians who had committed to transforming their lives and earnestly making the attempt to exemplify a morally consistent communistic life. Perhaps Frey thinks a bit too highly of his doctrine and is prone to exaggerations. But even so, the character of this little Russian village somewhere in a distant valley of Oregon seems to show promising activities are underway in America. So I want to ask really quick, are there any clarifying questions anyone wants to raise? Otherwise, we can move on. Okay. Let's keep it going then. All right. So Frey passes away several days later in early November 1888, and 9 years go by, and Frey is long gone, and Kropotkin travels to North America for the first time in 1897. On this journey, which is strung together with public lectures, speeches that he gives before packed crowds of thousands and thousands of people, he ventures all the way out to British Columbia in Canada before returning to the Northeast and staying a while in the New York area. He is welcomed by uh, two admirers, the American anarchists Harry Kelly and John H. Edelman. And Kropotkin is the major voice of anarchism at this time, anarchist communism, rejecting organized systems of rule and social control, of arbitrary hierarchy, and of domination in every sphere of life. So that would include domination of the people by top-down government, he rejects, by also domination of women by men, of the poor by the rich, and of one ethnic group by another. So he stays in the home of John Edelman in New York City, and one might imagine the kinds of discussions being had over dinner and around the fire. This period around the turn of the 20th century was marked by a series of what I can only call spectacular and bloody popular uprisings among American workers, among miners and railroad workers and steel workers from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho to the coal fields of Colorado, and many other parts of the country. To some, the radical social movements of the time, which had been developing especially since the 1870s, particularly since the Great Railroad Strike in 1877, which starts in West Virginia but sweeps across the United States from the Midwest, like Missouri and Illinois, up into New York. These events and the emergence of mass labor unions like the Knights of Labor and the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, as well as the early American socialist parties and agrarian populist parties, the Grangers, the Farmers Alliance, the People's Party. Um, these all seem to show that there was a burgeoning third revolution about to explode in the United States. The first being the War of Independence, and the second being the American Civil War. Uh, in his travels, Kropotkin sees that the United States had a serious potential for a radically different configuration of social life, political life, economic life, that was contrary to the dominating forces of the market, of industrial and financial capital. Sure, this was a land of businessmen, a land of Wall Street, of the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the JP Morgans, but far more so, it was a land of farmers, of workers, of many small, relatively egalitarian and democratic communities. These were most typically governed by the people who lived in them directly, through local political forms like town meetings, which to this day still have some existence in parts of New England and other regions. And this is all to say the democratic tendencies in the US were appearing to be on the verge of something really big, a movement to defeat the domination of the people by a government of self-serving statesmen and greedy industrialists and monopolistic landholders. This was, of course, in a period of time Mark Twain once nicknamed the Gilded Age, a name that stuck, which was defined by greater encroachments of the state and industrial capital, the marketplace, into new territories, which included the lives of everyday people. Commerce was being increasingly eaten up by monopolistic corporations, or joint stock companies, as people outside the United States call them. And the US government was basically at the mercy of a handful of rich businessmen, like during Grover Cleveland's presidency. JP Morgan bailed out the government when it was in financial straits. He alone had more money than the federal government. Uh, so while many of the elite of American society talked about this period as a time of great progress, of innovation and technological advancement, of civilization, which was, of course, wrapped up in the so-called civilizing missions of military imperialism, like in the Philippines, and massive industrial projects like the railroads or the Panama Canal after 1904. The conditions that the average American lived in were, in many regards, worse than they had been in the past. The encroachment of the state and the market into new areas of life brought the erosion of community autonomy, of community control over community issues, the ruining of many independent farmers, and absurdly low-paying wage labor that kept American workers, including immigrants, Black Americans, as well as a lot of domestically born white Americans, in conditions of deep poverty. And even the working hours alone demonstrate this. It was not uncommon for workers to beyond the clock for 16 hours a day. That's far, far more than the average medieval peasant, to put it in perspective. It seemed to those who were acutely conscious of the democratic spirit in the United States that this crisis of so many Americans being forced to live in degrading and demoralizing conditions while the richest men in the country ran the government as an oligarchy, this crisis was coming to a head, and it already seemed to be doing so in the form of mass labor strikes, of armed uprisings against company thugs and National Guards, um, dynamite bombings of mining operations, and the growth of mass labor parties and populist parties. People were fighting back. So in the Edelman household, Kropotkin is hosted not only by John Edelman, who is not the fellow in this photo. It's a man by the name of William Sinclair. He's also hosted by John Edelman's young wife, Rochelle. Rochelle Edelman is Russian, a Russian-born Jew who had been living in the United States since she was a teenager, since the early 1880s. And perhaps they have conversation in their shared language. Pyotr Kropotkin is a hero to Rochelle. She and John Edelman had even printed Kropotkin's writings in their periodical called Solidarity, one of the premier anarchist publications in the United States. Very likely, Kropotkin recalls that William Frey had told him of this communistic society out in Oregon, a little village of Russian exiles. Rochelle might know something about this. And indeed, Rochelle might have exclaimed, "Why, I knew William Frey. He lived with my family on the farm in Oregon." Rochelle, in fact, had been one of those Russian nihilists Frey had told Kropotkin of many years before. And almost certainly, Kropotkin asks for Rochelle to tell him more about this little community. This was the settlement of the Odessa Society of Farmers, otherwise known as New Odessa. So New Odessa emerged from the same broad radical movement in Russia that Kropotkin had once been involved with, the Narodnik movement, which pressed for popular socialism, taking as its foundation the Obshchina, the peasant commune or village, and working to establish a commune of communes, a confederation of the towns and villages with delegates of each working together through a constituent assembly, a revolutionary politic that would replace the regime of the Tsar and curb the encroachment of capital in Russia. In the late 1870s, the flagship party of this movement in Russia was called Narodnaya Volya, which means the people's will. Unlike the education-focused Tchaikovsky circle that Kropotkin had been part of, the Narodnaya Volya was a militant organization that made attempts to assassinate Russian officials, even the Tsar himself, seeing no options left. It was a period of intense government crackdowns on agitation. Political reforms were considered impossible in this period. It was often referred to as the White Terror, white being the emblematic color representing monarchism. The White Terror saw crackdowns on anyone even suspected of espousing any revolutionary inclinations, not even insurrectionists, but otherwise peaceful propagandists and people who were involved in study groups who were reading socialist literature smuggled in from the West. And this extended not only to those who were engaged in or suspected of engaging in these activities, but even people who were known to have connections with those hunted by the Tsarist police. That meant family members too. People were arrested and chucked straight into prison, or they might be deported to labor camps in Siberia. And the conditions in either case were horrendous. Disease, isolation, lack of nourishment, and often no communication with the outside world. Uh, it's not really that far off from how many prisons still are today. But good luck getting a trial. A lot of prisoners were locked up for years before even getting a day in court, and verdicts from revolutionaries tended to result in deportations to Siberia. In 1881, though, members of Narodnaya Volya succeeded in killing the Tsar, Alexander II, igniting a bomb and exploding his carriage during a parade. Some thought this might jolt the masses into a kind of disillusionment with the Tsarist state, but it backfired and riots broke out throughout the empire, particularly in the southwest. Much of these were targeted attacks against Jewish neighborhoods in the cities, such as in Warsaw, in what is now Poland, as well as Kiev and Odessa in what is today Ukraine. The idea of Jews being a subversive population had been emerging as an increasingly mainstream position by this period around Europe. And after the assassination in Russia, there were calls for reaction against Jews, reportedly encouraged by the new Tsar, Alexander III. It was the case that the revolutionary organizations like Narodnaya Volya incidentally had some disproportionately Jewish membership, but most Jews in Russia had no interest in revolution. And during these riots, which occurred between 1881 and 82, groups of young Jews, especially university students, organized armed self-defense leagues, like in Odessa, where they carried clubs to stand a chance in the street fighting. So a lot of these young, educated Jews were rather assimilated. Although they were surrounded by it in their neighborhoods, they were pretty disenchanted by the Orthodox Judaism, and many saw themselves more as Russians than Jews. The radical tendencies among them inclined them to see themselves as part of a broader world. And the socialistic types, especially, were committed to an international or non-national society of equals. But there were some nationalist thinkers among the Russian Jews, such as Leon Pinsker and Moses Leib Lilienblum, who had nothing but contempt for Judaism, but promoted notions of Jews being a nation or even a race. Not okay. And in the wake of the Tsar's assassination and the anti-Jewish riots, they fervently advocated for Jews to abandon Russia and to gather together in a land they could cultivate as farmers and be a nation among nations. These guys were some of the earliest Zionists or Jewish nationalists. And Lilienblum was one who wanted to see all Jews settled in Palestine. And this nationalistic reaction among some Jews led to a serious movement to get the hell out of Russia. They saw no future for Jews in Russia. It spurred the Bilu groups, the pioneers of what the Israelis today call the First Aliyah, or the return to Palestine, where Russian Jews, supported by certain Western European financiers, would establish agricultural settlements, but mostly hire local Arabs to do the labor, having no prior skills themselves. Some Jews in these circles in Russia turned to speaking in Yiddish instead of Russian. And they proclaimed that in these conditions, they had come to realize that they were first and foremost Jews. The bigger portion of the circles of young Jewish intellectuals in cities like Odessa were involved with what was called the Olam movement, which roughly means eternal people. They took as their emblem, which I have no photo of. I've never been able to find one. They took as their emblem an image of the two tablets of the Ten Commandments and a plow, indicating their intention to go out and work the land somewhere and to do it as Jews. Seeing the potential dangers of traveling to Palestine, though, which was at the time under the rule of the Ottoman Empire and was being eyeballed by the powers of Western Europe, especially the British Empire, it was a precarious area to be. The Olamniks looked instead to the United States. The US had been seen by Russians and especially revolutionaries as a land standing in sharp contrast to Russia, a land of democracy, of self-governance, and importantly for the Olamniks, a land of land, readily available land for cultivation. So the various Omolam groups from cities like Balta, Kherson, Kiev, and Odessa meet across the border in the city of Brody, which is also in what is today Ukraine. Some are able to make the crossing legally, but some, since these groups were under threat by the police and had associations with the revolutionary movement, some paid to be smuggled across the border. In Brody, they receive aid from the French Alliance Israélite Universelle, which helps fund their journey by ship across the Atlantic. It's a philanthropic organization based in France. And these groups arrive in New York, not all at once, but in various parties. And they enter the US via Castle Garden, which was the old immigration depot in what is now Battery Park, the southern tip of Manhattan Island in New York City. And most make it to New York by early 1882. So in New York, some of the Omolam groups settled together as communal societies in the tenements of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Members take on wage labor where they can find it, working in the New York sweatshops, and some travel to surrounding areas like in Pennsylvania to work on farms and build agricultural skills. And keep in mind, not only were Jews typically barred from agricultural work in Russia, but most of the Amalomniks were students and teachers and did not have much experience with manual labor. So they were learning as they went. One Amolam group coalesces in a shared home on Henry Street in New York City, gathering around the leadership of a man named Paul Kaplan. And when I say leadership, I don't mean that he was the charismatic figurehead of the group, but he was considered the most knowledgeable in the socialistic literature and was highly respected for his commitment to the movement. And many looked to him for advice and guidance. Multiple sources have also remarked that he was on the shorter side. One member, Israel Mandelkern, refers to him in his memoir as our little Kaplan. Other core members included Peter Fireman, a former student in the natural sciences who was notably tall and sported a reddish mustache, as well as Senya Cremont, who was the elder brother of Rochelle Edelman, who was described as a very handsome and kind man, often seen wearing his broad-brimmed hat and a full beard, although I haven't been able to confirm photos. This particular group was considerably the most revolutionary in their attitude. socialistic ideas were present to one degree or another throughout the movement, but this group was the most explicitly communistic, and they put it in writing. In 1882, this group of men and women draft and publish a charter, a mission statement, and set of bylaws constituting themselves as the Odesskaya Общество Землепашцев, or the Odessa Society of Farmers, uh, also called the New Odessa Community. I mess up the English, but not the Russian. Seeking help from the Emigrant Aid Society in New York, which was headed by an old participant of the Hungarian Revolution and journalist for The Nation, a paper that's still around, Michael Heilprin. The New Odessans are provided financial support for traveling to the West and purchasing land. Um, it's not clear to me why they did not go for homesteading somewhere on the basis of claiming squatters' rights. But nevertheless, they are convinced that Oregon has both land available and a suitable climate. And with collected donations from Jewish philanthropists in New York, with the biggest being from the financier Jacob Schiff, they embark via steamer to Oregon. There was no Panama Canal as of yet, so they took the ship to Panama, rode a train across the isthmus, and got another ship up to Portland. So in Portland, they settle in a communal home uh, for 6 months, and they're working around the area, variously on the railroads, in restaurant kitchens, and on surrounding farms, and they're saving money along the way. And they find land and settle in the Cow Creek Valley in early 1883. They establish the farm that they had intended to, and the plot of land was, I believe, 760 acres, and it's just on the eastern side of what is now the city of Glendale. All right. There's a piece of their constitution. I have yet to make a working translation of this that's legible, but it's there. I'm working on it. All right. So at this point, I'm going to ask if anyone has any quick questions for clarifications before I jump into the discussion of life on the commune.
I don't really have a question, but the whole scenario of what you told about the history seems very similar to what we see now. You know, that the whole international kind of revolution or change in the system. It'll be interesting to see how we fare out in history.
Yeah, the more that I've looked into the happenings, that even the ideas of this period around the turn of the 20th century, the more eerily similar it appears to this day. And I don't think it's a mistake that certain uh, certain government heads of state in the United States have explicitly said that they wanted to make America be like the Gilded Age again. Uh, all right. So I don't have too many more images, so I'm going to talk more of in a story time type fashion with the rest of this. So they settle in the Cow Creek Valley in 1883, and the first party, the first members who are venturing out into the lands uh, of the Umpqua are seeing what's there on the land. There are a few existing houses. little log cabins. There are a couple old barns. Um, one one member I have a memoir from describes them really almost as shacks. Um, so a few members of the group are heading out to the land, are there for a few weeks before the rest of the New Odessa group arrives, and they find the first members are sleeping in this broken down barn, are living a very Spartan lifestyle, living off the land, hunting where they can. They're not all vegetarians as of yet. Um, and immediately they get to building housing. They start by building a community center, which also has a second story that functions as a dormitory. There are additions made to one or two of the other farmhouses that were on the land. Uh, and the big house, the two-story house, is where most of the colonists are sleeping in shared quarters. Those who are of smaller family units, who have spouses, maybe children, live together in their own individual rooms in the existing farmhouses. So not everybody's just living together in one space, although a good amount of them were. This is already beginning to be shaped into a kind of little village. Um, so they are purchasing animals and equipment. They buy cattle and horses. They buy their plows and other machinery. They also uh, buy a couple oxen, which I'll talk about shortly. Funny story. Um, and in 1883, in July of 1883, William Frey, who we discussed earlier, arrives to guide the community. The members of New Odessa, while they were in New York, had encountered William Frey. He was in New York helping migrants at the time. He spoke Russian, of course, so he was very helpful to these incoming waves of Russian immigrants. And he had just been finished at Cedar Vale in Kansas and was pretty uncertain about the possibility for a communistic society being realized in such a way. But he has an encounter with the New Odessans, and the New Odessans understand him as a much older man with experience in many, many different agricultural communities. They understand him as something of an expert, someone who they can learn from, and also a man of very clear conviction. So they invite him as a special guest to stay with them at New Odessa. So he's never exactly a member of New Odessa, but he is the honored guest among a few honored guests. Uh, he does not live in the farmhouses or the shared dormitory. He has with him his wife Mary, his second companion named Lydia Eichhoff, both of whom he has children with, and they together pitch a tent on the side of the hill. One memoir says that he could see Mount Shasta from there, but I believe he actually meant Mount McLaughlin. So he's living kind of separately, but still on this shared land with everyone. And while Frey is there, he develops a daily schedule and implores the members of the community to live austerely according to the teachings of his religion of humanity. I'll read a quick passage from a firsthand account This is a man by the name of Petrakovsky. He says, writing in August of 1883, about a month ago, the Frey family arrived. With their arrival, a new regimen was established. We undertook the study of mathematics under the instructorship of Frey and the study of English under Mary and Lydia, the wife and sister-in-law of William Frey, respectively. This is just what they called Lydia. This is our daily schedule. We work from 6 o'clock in the morning till 8:30 in the morning. From 8:30 to 8:45, we have breakfast. Work is resumed at 10 o'clock and continued to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Between 4 and 5 o'clock is dinner, followed by a rest period and intellectual activity. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday are devoted to the study of mathematics, English, and to Frey's lecture on the philosophy of positivism. On Wednesday, current matters are discussed, and on Saturday, the problems of the commune. On Sunday, we rise at 6 o'clock, and immediately a lively discussion begins on the subject of equal rights for women. Thus, the time passes till breakfast. This meal consists of rice, oatmeal, baked and raw apples, beans, potatoes, bread, and milk. The members of the commune are vegetarians. After breakfast, one member goes to survey the farm, another reads a newspaper or a book. The rest sing, shout, and dance. At 4 o'clock, dinner is served. Two men wash the dishes, the choir sings, the organ plays. At 7 o'clock in the evening begins a session of mutual criticism. Then the work for the week is assigned. So this is a overview of what you would find in the average week. There's a lot of singing and dancing. There are regular meetings and discussions, serious discussions about moral and ethical problems, about science and philosophy. Frey, man of science, is teaching everyone mathematics, really continuing the university education. Some of them do not have a university education, so heck, a free school. And importantly, they're all learning English with the help of the Frey family. And also, they have these sessions of mutual criticism. These would involve the raising of issues that members of the community had with one another, saying, well, you did this thing the other day that was not helpful for our community, and we need you to amend your behavior, and work to do better. And some historians have said, well, people get hard feelings about this, potentially, but this, by most accounts, seems to have been done in a very cordial and brotherly way. This was very much a fraternal and sororal organization. So we'll talk a little bit about the personalities of New Odessa. Here's the most well-known image of the group. I have yet to identify everybody in the picture, but a couple are pretty clear to me. But some of the people include a man named Levitin. Levitin was considered to be the axeman of the community. He was kind of tall. He's one of these people, potentially. I'm pretty sure this photo was late 1884 after he left, but I'm still trying to figure out the exact date. So there's Levitin, there's what's important about Levitin? He's very professedly atheistic. He was said by one member in a memoir to be the kind of person who would proclaim atheism from the rooftops. And he was also apparently inclined toward the very militant anarchistic views of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who I briefly mentioned earlier. Another man who lived in the community was someone named Shapiro. It's the only name I could find. It's probably just the surname. Shapiro was a Hebrew scholar back in Russia and was considered to be something of a mystic. And he was the community hermit. Shapiro, instead of living in the shared dormitory or in one of the family farmhouses, uh, built himself a little shack, a little hut in the wooded area of the farm and lived by himself and would sometimes not really steal, but sneak into the main house and take apples from the pantry in the middle of the night. He was described as something of a little ghost. There are other people such as George Rosenson. George Rosenson, who was I think one of the members in this photo, was a veterinary student back in Russia. So he served as the veterinarian and tended to the animals very closely on the farm. He was described as a kind of a shorter, stocky man, but very calm and friendly. Um, there were uh, there were quite hysterical members of the community. There was one who went by the name of Fox, who became a very devout follower of Frey's teachings, unlike some of the other members. And he would go on rants and raves in discussion sessions, sometimes for an hour or so, going on about who knows what. Uh, and there were some more sickly members. There's a man named Umansky who was very close to the Freys, was tended to, kind of nursed by the by Lydia Eichhoff, Frey's other companion, and he actually stayed in their tent with them. Uh, I suppose I should talk about the neighbors. The There is a passage that describes a little bit about the relationship with the neighbors in one memoir by the member Israel Mandelkern. He writes, "Our neighbors were on the best of terms with us and always happy to be of service and exchange favors. The farmers kept us posted as to the seasons for planting and reaping our crops and what vegetables it was best to plant, etc. We in turn repaired for them in our excellent shops any implement they would bring, getting in return only a thank you and a handshake. In particular, we were on good terms with our neighbor Jackson and his beautiful daughter, the teacher in the neighborhood's Little Red Schoolhouse, and with the widow Wood, who was, in addition to farming, practicing midwifery and was the medical advisor to all the farmers. And it was generally considered by historians who've written about New Odessa that they had pretty good relations with their neighbors. Their neighbors, or some of them, even taught them square dancing, which was quite novel to them. So about the lifestyle, we mentioned the schedule a little bit. So most were eventually won over to the idea of living as vegetarians. And although not everyone was really convinced of the certain moral value of vegetarianism or temperance, of abstaining from even coffee, from tea, tobacco, they had such respect for William Frey that they largely went along with his insistence. Uh, But in lieu of coffee, they had this beverage that Mandel Kern referred to as community coffee. And this was made with roasted bread crusts. And he said it tasted like postum, uh, an old coffee alternative. So not that bad. Um, I also want to remark that, as it was noted in their routine, they worked about 8.5 hours of labor a day. Um, they were mostly cutting timber for the railroad, the Oregon and California Railroad, providing it with lumber for railroad ties. And this is how they made most of their income, not from agriculture. But these 8.5 hours of labor on an average day was, although some historians have said this is a lot of work, this is about half as much as some workers in the United States were working in industrial labor at this time. And I think it goes to show that they did actually prioritize other activities because they were able to in their circumstances, or they thought they were able to. They had evening lectures and discussions. This was a highly intellectual, discussion-oriented group. Um, and I mentioned timber. Other than timber, some of the members were skilled machinists, and uh, to help support the community and its common fund, they would work in some parts of what became the city of Glendale. Uh, but otherwise, most of the rest of the labor will involve tending to the farm and to the households. And there was something of a gender division of labor, um, not because of political inequality, but they had discussions about this and decided that this was the optimal arrangement. Although many of the women did end up working in the in the woods cutting timber near the end. There were also lots of happenings and celebrations. The first winter of the commune's existence in late 1883, they got a shipment of supplies from Paul Kaplan, their kind of guide or advisor, uh, key founder of the community, who was still stationed in New York and was trying to get money to support them from certain donors, as well as talking to people and encouraging more potential members to move to Oregon and join the community, especially immigrants. Uh, so Kaplan helps get them winter gear in the first winter, and they include warm jackets and rubber boots and Mother Hubbard dresses, which are these old fashionable American dresses, pretty commonplace to wear among American women in the 1880s. So the women in the community were apparently very excited to don this new, especially American outfit. They had monthly festivals. The Religion of Humanity had a totally new formulation of a calendar. And at the beginning of every month, there was a holiday festival, usually celebrating some famous historical figure. They celebrated Moses and Jesus and Isaac Newton. Um, but these were calls for lots of celebrations. Celebrations were very frequent. Uh, in fact, there were celebrations even for the births of children. A few children were born at the community, and also for Independence Day, July 4th uh, in American history. The one account from Mandel Kern's memoir uh, states, on the 22nd of June, my first child was born. Joy and festivity took the place of religious disputes in the community. The grand festive day at the season was the national holiday, the 4th of July. We decided to celebrate this day in the open, so we went out for a picnic to the tunnel. This tunnel had been cut for the Oregon and California Railroad. It was the most picturesque spot in our vicinity. The day was delightful for a picnic. We had the singing of national songs that we had learned in connection with our hymnal exercises. Gaskin read out the Declaration of Independence and gave us a talk on the history of this day. And Frey took for his text, "The railroads, arteries of humanity." He described the railroads as carriers of food and products, just as the arteries in an animal organism are the carriers of blood. This lecture furnished food for thought, but not for disputation. It was another day of exaltation and love, and of course, not without a due share of kisses. There's a lot of kissing um, in this community, old fraternal kissing. Uh, Other interesting events throughout the history included uh, there was a creek flooding one season. The land spanned Cow Creek, and one day the community woke up to find that the creek had flooded over by quite a ways, and their cattle, whom they milked in the mornings, were on the other side of this flooded creek. And one member, Moishe Hellman, takes it upon himself to jump up on one of the workhorses and trudge through Cow Creek with pails in hand to milk the cows and bring the community their morning milk for breakfast. Um, and of course, as I said, they had picnics. There were debates. There was lots of singing. They were learning American songs. They were singing Russian songs. Some people knew Russian and Ukrainian revolutionary songs. There were some Yiddish, but it was mostly in Russian. Um, Celebrations on these festivals um, were calls for parties. Neighbors were invited from around the valley, and people would come from really all over the Cow Creek Valley to attend these dances at New Odessa. And their favorite was, of course, the American square dancing, which they had learned when they came here. Uh, there are weddings that happen at New Odessa, one of which happens in 1885 between Rochelle Edelman's sister and another member of the community named Alexander Kislik, both of whom were considered anarchists by some historians. Um, Paul Kaplan arrives from New York and joins the community properly in mid 1884. And there are stories about him humming lullabies to some of the young babies in the community, rocking them to sleep. Old Yiddish songs. Uh, there's another funny story of Israel Mandelkern, who writes one of the best memoirs, uh, wanting to wallpaper one of the rooms of one of the farmhouses, and he goes to William Frey, who has a collection of little magazines, illustrated magazines that he's collected, and he he convinces Frey to let him use the magazines to tear them apart and use them as wallpaper, and it becomes something like an art gallery. Um, so ultimately, though, there are indeed factional tensions that develop between those members who are pretty close followers of Frey, those who are very convinced by his ideas, and other members of the community who are respectful of Frey and appreciate some of his ideas, but are not committed to the idea of a religion, especially not modeled after Catholicism. They were all, of course, Jews, and that seemed kind of funny to a lot of them. Uh, there are visitors to the community. There's a man named Gaskin who's kind of a communist tourist who travels around the United States, um, living for periods of time at different intentional communities. There's a rabbi who visits in mid 1884, Rabbi Judah Wexler, who's from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he writes an article that's kind of poo-pooing the goals of the community, but some people in the community find him kind of laughable and silly. They're showing him around the farm, and they have a log crossing over Cow Creek that is perfectly fine for most of the people in the community. But when this Rabbi Wexler comes, he's so afraid of crossing the creek on this little log bridge that he has one of the members carry them over on his back, wading through the creek. Um, so there's a lot of making fun of this funny rabbi who shows up. Uh, in 1884, though, William Frey falls ill, and he decides to leave to spread his doctrine before his impending death. He has this understanding that he's dying by 1884, and he would die 4 years later. Um, and reportedly, over a dozen members leave after Frey. The numbers in this community have been variously counted. I think the average was about 35 people. So a dozen to about 15 members leave, which is roughly half the community. And several people follow Frey even abroad. On his deathbed, one former member of New Odessa is there with him, named Martin Sahud. Um, so the community continues after Frey leaves. This is especially highlighted by the fact that one of the best accounts of the life of the New Odessans was in 1885, the year after he left. But there's otherwise very little information about the latter years of the community's existence in Oregon, which was most of its existence. We do know that the tenability of the community was frequently discussed, but after a fire destroyed the community's library in 1886 and part of the community center, their main building, the morale was also pretty low. And ultimately, the community decides to abandon the farm by the end of 1886. So it's only in the Glendale area between early 1883 and late 1886. So about 4 years, a little less than 4 years. But still, most of that history is not very well documented. The best memoirs written by Petrakovsky and Mandelkern are only members who stay for about 1.5, 2 years. So much of the rest is something of a mystery, open for speculation. The members do decide to go separate ways. A few were said to have moved to Portland and started a mercantile business. I'm still looking into that. Member named Morris Free immigrates to Mexico. I have a book by one of his descendants. The Mendelkern family and the Hedman family, who were at New Odessa, moved to San Francisco. And one of the children of the Hedman family becomes something of a successful architect. But the core members who were close to Paul Kaplan were decided to remain together, and they moved to New York City. And when they were in New York City, they established a laundry co-op. And Kaplan believed that in this way, New Odessa might still be able to fulfill its goals. So this is on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But for one reason or another, New Odessa's laundry business of the remaining dozen members is closed by 1891. And unfortunately, there's next to no information that I've found on this portion of New Odessa's history yet. Um, Still looking into it. Um, Peter Fireman, one of the members, ends up studying chemistry and economy at university in Germany. Kaplan studies medicine at Columbia University. He finishes school in Berlin before returning to New York City. The Rosenbluth family, who are involved in New Odessa, study medicine. They were known for sheltering some early Cuban revolutionaries in New York as well. Anyukta Cremont, who is a younger sibling of Senya Cremont and Richelle Edelman. Uh, she studies dentistry. Some others work in various industrial wage labor, and most of the Cremont family, who were all at New Odessa, attend classes at Cooper Union in New York. Senya Cremont, the eldest of the Cremont clan and one of the co-founders of New Odessa, he returns to Europe. He eventually comes to head a trading company in England that manages wheat trading in the Black Sea. And Richelle Cremont, who becomes Richelle Edelman, um, she enters circles of followers of Henry George, who was a major economic political reformer in the late 19th century. And she ends up joining circles of anarchists, where she meets and marries John H. Edelman. And they publish the periodical Solidarity during the 1890s. So I'll kind of conclude with some information about Paul Kaplan, who I've spent a good amount of time looking into. So in 1901, Pyotr Kropotkin, who we started our story with, he returns to the US for another visit. And he had, in the meantime, actually been working closely with Richelle Edelman's younger sister, Mary Cremont, who had moved to England and was working on a publication called Freedom, or probably one of the most famous anarchist periodicals of the time. So Mary Cremont is working with Peter Kropotkin. Mary Cremont had been a younger adolescent at New Odessa, but was a New Odessan nonetheless. And when Kropotkin is in New York in 1901, he's invited to a private dinner on Henry Street on the Lower East Side, where he meets with the famous humanitarian nurse Lillian Wald, as well as the Yiddish playwright Jacob Gordon, and others. But around the corner from the Henry Street settlement, or the nurses' settlement, which Lillian Wald ran and where this dinner took place, was the office of one Dr. Paul Kaplan, who was of New Odessa. And so I would imagine that Kaplan, who was reported, at least in a couple instances, of being an associate of Peter Kropotkin, had potentially had dinner with them on this night. And Kaplan, as I said, worked as a physician. He was known for tending to the poor. He was also part of the Immigrant Aid Society in his later years. He was involved in distributing funds to people who were seeking refuge in the United States, especially people seeking political asylum. And on the Lower East Side, he was fondly called Kaplansha, which is kind of a pet name, almost a familial name for him. He was known for his humanitarianism, everyone went to him for advice. Foreign visitors sought him out. Um, and with Jacob Gordon, the Yiddish playwright, he actually co-founded an organization called the Educational League, which was a rival to the still existing, uh, more sustainable, I guess, Educational Alliance, um, which is still based in New York City. Um, they thought that the Educational League in their minds, as opposed to the Educational Alliance, would offer free critical education to the public, as opposed to the Educational Alliance uh, being so focused on merely assimilating people and indoctrinating people into conformity with um, labor relations in the United States, among other things. Um, from the very beginning, though, Kaplan had been the member of New Odessa who was best read in the socialist literature. He was considered a lifelong revolutionary, and he was a central figure of the core group of New Odessa. And in those latter years, which we don't have that much information on of New Odessa, he really was the guiding force of the community, clearly. Uh, and for him, New Odessa was meant to become a place of refuge. New Odessa was to be something new, built in the shell of the old. And it was meant to demonstrate the possibility for a communistic life. Its central stated goal in its mission statement was to establish a society based on mutual assistance, which is similar to the language Kropotkin would use in his publications, mutual aid. And through mutual assistance, the society would help its members to grow and flourish and live decent and moral lives. And New Odessa was managed by the members themselves, and they had a political structure. In New York City, before they moved to Oregon, they had created a routine of regular community meetings with elected members and rotating meeting chairs. Peter Fireman was elected as president of the society, but this was little more than a formality for external affairs. And internally, everybody was afforded opportunity to lead. Um, New Odessa's constitution and key principles included the refusal to use hired labor, to establish two different funds, common funds for creating institutions like schools and hospitals in their community of the future, and for helping people to join and leave. They had a fund that was specifically set up to help the prospective members, people who were interested in joining New Odessa, to actually travel to New Odessa to join the community and to get them started in the community. And when a member was expressing interest in leaving, that fund was also used to help members leave. So everybody left on really nice terms. Uh, that's all right. Um, Everybody left on really nice terms. Um, the uh, uh, where was I? So if somebody wanted to leave, the community chipped in to buy them a ticket to where they wanted to go. Very supportive from beginning to end. They also mandated political equality. And this meant that men, women, Jews, non-Jews, Russian, non-Russians, American members, of which there were some, and Russian members, whoever, were all political equals. Everybody had an equal say in their community meetings. Um, and everybody after a certain age was afforded a vote. I think it was when you turned 16, you were able to participate in discussions about community decisions. And when you turned 18, you were able to have a vote. Everybody had a vote. Um, and also secular education was mandated after 6 years of age. They were very serious about education, and one that was separated from religious indoctrination, although Frey had, other ideas. And education was not something that stopped when you hit a certain age. It was part of the fabric of the society. Every day was treated as an educational experience. There were discussions, debates, lectures, classes, reading together that took place on a daily basis. Um, so the big question is, the last real question is, why was the farm abandoned by the end of 1886? Uh, One reason that I've been dwelling on is the fact that the choice of the location of the farm had actually been influenced by a man named Henry Villard. Henry Villard was an owner of the Oregon and California Railroad, who was an associate of some of the financiers who had chipped in money to help New Odessa get started. And presumably, his recommendation that they move to Oregon and to the Cow Creek Valley, specifically along the then in development Oregon and California Railroad, was specifically so that they could work on the railroad. Thus, the community found itself dependent on wages from the railroad. And the railroad in this period, contrary to what we might think of now, the railroad was a great thing. It helped cities like, Roseburg and Glendale, et cetera, boom. Well, the railroad was actually controversial. Most Americans scorned the railroads at this time. Monopolies were rapidly developing due to its private control, privileging of routes, and certain companies. And independent agriculture was becoming far less feasible as a result, with many farmers no longer able to sustain themselves by selling produce on the market. So New Odessa had been formed in a losing situation, I think. They had hoped to sustain themselves through agricultural work, through cultivating their own land. But in the 1880s in the US, this was actually very difficult to do. Sometimes it was an impossible choice of occupation. And the community was scraping by, and potentially it needed to take out more loans to build themselves a sawmill to maintain the settlement. They were living in debt to profiteers, contrary to what they had hoped. As for Frey's involvement, he was respected, but a good portion of the community did not adhere to his doctrine. He was never really a formal member of New Odessa, as I said, just a special guest. And for as much influence as he had, he was simply not present for most of New Odessa's existence in Oregon. Nor did he contribute to the formulation of the Constitution of New Odessa. And his beliefs that this community had been fundamentally transformed by his teachings seems a bit of an exaggeration. He was an exaggerator. In the latter years, there were many discussions about the viability of the community. Could New Odessa fulfill its goals? Critics, including some close to Kaplan, his former roommate in New York City, Abraham Kahan, who was the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, a very famous Yiddish socialist newspaper in New York. He argued that New Odessa would only ever be a drop in the bucket, that it was not a realistic avenue to bring about a social revolution, and trying to set an example in a far-flung corner of the world was not going to cut it. And in doing so, they brought their mentalities with them. They brought the industrial capitalistic society of Europe and of the United States with them into the countryside. And only a core group of the members were wholly committed to the project. By the time the farm was abandoned, there were only about a dozen members left. And it seems that this would not have been an adequate population for sustaining the project for longer. But it is important that they all deliberately decided to leave. They didn't try to stick it out after a certain point. It is possible that they just could not compete as an independent farm or a cooperative laundry when they went to New York, against the industrial monopolies that were developing in the Gilded Age. But Kaplan's goal had been to support revolutionary movements, and this would entail being where the revolutionaries were, where the immigrants were. The purpose of New Odessa was really better served in a different way. And Kaplan never lost faith in the potential of the US. He saw the federal system, the legacy of the American Revolution, and the emphasis on self-governance as a skeleton for a true democratic society. And I think it's worth noting that when Kaplan continues to live in New York City into the 20th century, he becomes involved in very serious revolutionary organizations. He's not just part of societies that are advocating for um, advocating for social revolution in Russia. The Friends of Russian Freedom group he was involved with. He's not only involved with helping immigrants who are arriving at Castle Garden and then Ellis Island through his familiarity with philanthropists who were willing to chip in money to help people at the time. But in the early 20th century, he joins up with the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party, which was for 2 decades the most popular party in the Russian Empire, really up until the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks came to power at the end of 1917. So he was never a Marxist. He was always a populist. And that really could be said of some of the other members of New Odessa who I've kept tabs on their lives afterward. People engaged in circles of anarchists and popular socialists and the labor movement, some descendants of New Odessa, which will have to be a whole other presentation. Some descendants of New Odessa got involved with the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s and helped refugees fleeing Spain as it was being taken over by a fascist government under Francisco Franco. These were people, at least the core group of New Odessa, who were devoted in many different ways to a revolution, not just a revolution in Russia, not one in the United States alone, but in the whole world. And even even in the later years of their lives, it was understood by by those who wrote their obituaries that men like Kaplan and women of New Odessa like Rochelle Edelman really remembered what the purpose of New Odessa was supposed to be. And although the farm in the Glendale area, did not really satisfy what a revolution required, they were still committed to the goal. And so I'll leave you all with this quote from one Peter Kropotkin, who we started our story with, from, let's see, there's the quote here. I have things blocking my screen. From among 100 men taken at random in Europe, you will not find as many so ready to set forth on untraveled paths as in America. In America, $1 is It's nowhere else given so little importance. It is won or it is lost. In England, one values and worships the pound, but definitely not in America. That is America. Any village in Oregon is better than the smallest hamlet in Germany. Oregon and New Odessa represent to him the spirit of what it means to be an American, at least in his understanding. That's all I have for you. I don't even know what time it is.
Well, boy, has it changed, so America, the vision of America from the 1880s. Um, so actually, it's almost 20 after 8. And are there any questions or comments from the folks in the audience?
That was a beautiful talk.
Very informative. And what piqued my interest when I first talked with Zach, read something about from the News Review, is it piqued my interest because of the progressive side of this, because we live in rural red Douglas County. And there's always this, this perception of, no one else but that existed here in Oregon. And there's a lot that there in Douglas County. So the whole idea of the whole community was very interesting to me. So thank you very much for doing all this work and letting us know what
Interesting.
happened here.
Yeah. I like their daily rituals.
They're a funny bunch.
Hmm.
One really has to remember that this group was a group of young people. They were a lot of them straight out of the university or just ditched the university and joined the movement. So some of the youngest members who were not just children were like 18, 19 years old.
A lot
But
of
most of these people
enthusiasm.
were early mid 20s, with some exceptions. There were a couple older members, but for the most part, these were young idealists who were committed to uh, committed to this vision of a better society. What better place than Oregon, at least at first.
Yeah, at least to try it out. And I could certainly see that, revolutions aren't going to happen in, that area of the world in 1880s.
Yeah.
So does anybody else want to make a comment before we, disconnect the huge live stream and sign off? Oh, all right. Thank you very much, Zach.
Yes. Thank you, Zach.
I'm still here. I'm just stopping the screen sharing.
Thank you.
Okay.